April 8, 1943. 27,000 feet above Caen, France. The oxygen mask couldn't hide the grin of Oberleutnant Rolf Herrmann, who watched the hulking silhouettes through the crystal-clear lantern of his Focke Wulf 190A5 rise heavily towards his formation. The veteran ace of the Luftwaffe, with 26 victories, carefully studied the American fighters who were fighting for the first time over occupied Europe. "The Allies sent us milk bottles in flight," he told his wingman, unable to contain his laughter at the sight of the massive Republic P-47 Thunderbolts struggling to gain altitude. Below them, 16 P-47C Thunderbolts from the 4th Fighter Group were lumbering upward in a tight formation, their 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engines straining against their 7-ton weight. To German pilots accustomed to sleek Spitfires and nimble Soviet fighters, these burly American machines seemed almost comical. Barrel-shaped fuselages topped with greenhouse-like lanterns, wings that seemed too small for their massive bodies, propellers that dwarfed everything in the Luftwaffe arsenal. What Herrmann did not know, what none of the German pilots circling overhead like wolves could have imagined, was that they were witnessing the arrival of weapons that would systematically destroy the Luftwaffe's fighter power. Within 18 months, these flying milk bottles will transform from objects of ridicule into instruments of horror, and their 8 half-inch Browning machine guns will become the scariest sound in the German sky. The math of destruction was already loaded into those wide wings. 3,400 rounds, a combined rate of fire of 6,000 rounds per minute, enough concentrated firepower to rip a Messerschmitt in half in less than 2 seconds. The transformation began that April morning when Major Donald Blaxley, the commander of the 335th Fighter Squadron, noticed how the German formation was taking up an attack position. The Eagle Squadron veteran, who had transferred from the RAF Spitfires just a few weeks earlier, understood what his men had not yet known. Surviving on the P-47 required giving up everything they knew about aerial combat. The Thunderbolt represented a radical departure from the conventional fighter design philosophy. While the Germans were aiming for lightweight interceptors optimized for climb and maneuverability, Republic aviation created something unprecedented. A high-altitude behemoth that used mass, power, and firepower to redefine the rules of aerial warfare. Among the 56 American pilots scattered across the skies of France that morning were men who were destined to become legends, future aces whose names would strike fear into the hearts of the Luftwaffe. But on April 8, 1943, they were rookies on an untested machine, facing off against the most experienced fighter force in the world. The Germans had been fighting continuously since 1939, with veterans of Poland, France, Britain, and Russia behind them. The Americans participated in the fighting for exactly 0 days. This is a story about how industrial logic prevailed over tactical brilliance, how quantity and quality merged into overwhelming superiority, and how the laughter of German pilots turned to horror when they learned what synchronized Browning machine guns could do to an airplane at a distance of 400 yards. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt appeared as a result of the panic in June 1940. When German fighters were flying over France, Alexander Kartveli, the chief designer of Republic Aviation, originally from Georgia, received urgent technical requirements from the U.S. Army Air Force. They needed a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching the best examples of the Luftwaffe. Instead, Kartveli designed a monster that redefined what was possible. "It's going to be a dinosaur," Kartveli admitted to his development team, "but it's going to be a dinosaur with good proportions."
The prototype of the X-47B, which first took to the air on May 6, 1941, shocked everyone who saw it. At an empty weight of 9,900 pounds, it weighed 65% more than its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer. The massive turbocharging system, with its complex system of air ducts running through the rear of the fuselage, gave it an almost pregnant appearance. The test pilots who approached him for the first time invariably asked the same question: does this thing really fly? He didn't just fly, he flew unlike anything else at altitude. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower, could maintain full power at an altitude of 27,000 feet, where German fighters were suffocating. The turbocharger, powered by exhaust gases, provided performance at sea level in the stratosphere, where the air was too thin for conventional superchargers. Major Hubert Hub Zamak, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, who was trained in Bridgeport, Connecticut, initially despised the aircraft. His unit lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training accidents between September 1942 and January 1943. The P-47 killed more Americans in training than the Germans would kill in the first months of combat. He jacked up on landing, rotated from the torque on takeoff, and dived with such enthusiasm that the pilots discovered compressibility. Their controls froze when shock waves formed on the wings. But those who mastered it discovered something extraordinary. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma who would become one of the best American aces with 27 victories, described his first flight as follows: "It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive. The power was incredible. You didn't fly it, you aimed it." The first military clashes in April and May of 1943 confirmed all the prejudices of the Germans. The P-47 could not turn with the Focke Wulf 190, could not climb with the Messerschmitt 109, could not match their agility at medium altitudes. Luftwaffe pilots quickly developed tactics to exploit these weaknesses, attacking from below where heavy Thunderbolts had difficulty, forcing maneuverable battles where agility mattered more than firepower. Hauptmann Josef Pips Priller, commander of Jagdwaffe 26, reported to headquarters after his first encounter: "The new American fighter is meat for the slaughterhouse. He flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow. Our guys called him turkeys, fat targets pretending to be warriors." The statistics seem to confirm the Germans' confidence. In their first month of operations, American fighter groups lost 14 Thunderbolts with only 3 confirmed German victories. RAF, watching from her Spitfire squadrons, quietly hinted that the Americans might reconsider their choice of vehicle. British pilots joked that the best evasive maneuver on the P-47 was to unbuckle and run through the spacious cabin. But there was something strange going on in those first clashes that German intelligence did not notice. The P-47 that were shot down sustained an incredible amount of damage before falling. One plane returned from a mission on May 4th with 21 cannon holes and more than 100 machine gun hits, damage that would have blown a Messerschmitt or a Spitfire to pieces. The massive radial engine, devoid of vulnerable cooling systems, brushed off hits that would have stopped a liquid-cooled fighter. More importantly, when the P-47 did aim their guns at the target, the results were disastrous. The Thunderbolt's weapons battery created a convergence destruction zone that the German pilots had never experienced. Unlike the rifle-caliber weapons of early fighter aircraft or guns with limited ammunition, the American fighter could fire continuously for more than 30 seconds, which was an eternity in aerial combat. The event that began to change German perception occurred on June 26, 1943, over Lazy-les-Fraux, France. It included 2nd Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron and an encounter that would become legendary on both sides of the conflict.
Johnson's formation of 48 P-47s was returning from an escort when they were attacked by 16 Focke Wulf 190s from the second flight of Jagdwaffe 26, led by Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, the younger brother of the famous Adolf Galland. The Germans executed a perfect attack, diving out from behind the sun with an overwhelming advantage in speed. Johnson's Thunderbolt, flying at the tail of the formation, was caught in the crossfire of several attackers, suffering catastrophic damage in the very first seconds of the battle. 21 20mm shells exploded in his plane. The lantern shattered, hydraulic fluid sprayed into the cabin, the engine hood was torn off, and a fire broke out behind the dashboard. Johnson, wounded in the nose and leg by shrapnel and fragments of bullets, tried to jump out but found that the lantern was jammed. A 20mm shell exploded in the guide of the lantern, sealing it tightly. He was trapped in a dying airplane at an altitude of 27,000 feet. What happened next refuted all assumptions about the admissibility of combat damage. Despite the lack of a forward view due to an oil-soaked windshield, a barely functioning engine that was shaking violently, and controls that responded only periodically, Johnson managed to straighten the plane and steer it towards England. The P-47 continued to fly with damage that would have turned any other fighter into falling debris. Then it got worse. A lone Focke Wulf 190, piloted by an unknown pilot from the second flight of Luftwaffe 26, discovered a damaged Thunderbolt limping towards the English Channel at a speed of less than 170 miles per hour. Historical research has never established the identity of this pilot, although several names have been suggested based on German combat reports of the day. This was followed by one of the most unusual clashes in the history of air warfare. The German pilot took up position behind Johnson's P-47 and opened fire with his 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. Johnson, unable to evade, could only crouch behind his armor plate and pray. The Thunderbolt had consumed all the cannon ammunition. Then the German changed position and opened fire again, this time only with his machine guns. Having exhausted his cannon ammunition, the German pilot flew up next to him, staring incredulously at the flying wreck. Johnson could clearly see his face, young, blonde, his expression changing from confidence to confusion to something like fear. The German changed position again and fired the remaining machine gun ammunition at the Thunderbolt. He was still flying. He flew up next to me again, shook his head in obvious amazement, gave an informal salute, and turned away, presumably due to lack of ammunition. Johnson's P-47 landed in Manston. The engine failed on the runway. The chief mechanic stopped counting bullet holes, reaching 200. One cannon shell exploded inches from Johnson's head. The other detonated on an armored plate behind his seat. The engine took direct hits. The control cables were partially cut. 3 of the 4 main spars, the structural backbone of the fuselage, were pierced, and yet the plane brought him home. The survival of Johnson's plane caused shock in both air armies. American engineers who studied the wreckage realized that they had underestimated their own creation. German intelligence, having received combat reports from the second flight of Luftwaffe 26, initially refused to believe it. No aircraft could withstand so much damage, but the testimony of several pilots confirmed the impossible. The Thunderbolt had withstood everything the Luftwaffe's best fighter could bring down on it and survived.
By July 1943, American pilots were learning how to use the true strengths of the P-47. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemek, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, discovered the secret through brutal trial and error. Don't mess with them. Do not gain altitude with them at low altitude. Use your weight. Use your power. Use your guns. The massive mass of the Thunderbolt, initially perceived as a disadvantage, became a weapon. Nothing could catch up with him in a dive. From 30,000 feet, the P-47 could reach speeds of 550 miles per hour, faster than any German fighter could achieve, even in a vertical dive. This speed could be converted to altitude with a zoom dial that left pursuing fighters helplessly behind. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin, who would become one of the first American aces in Europe, developed what became known as the boom and zoom tactic, although the pilots called it the turkey slaughterhouse on the Thunderbolt. Instead of engaging in traditional dogfights, the P-47 formations gained altitude to 30,000 feet, higher than the German fighters could effectively operate. When the Luftwaffe fighters appeared below, the Thunderbolts turned over and dived, reaching speeds that made preemptive firing impossible for the defending Germans. At the end of these dives, the American heavy machine guns began to speak. The German pilots who survived described it as a collision with a wall of lead. The combined firepower created an impenetrable zone of destruction. Planes falling into this convergence zone didn't just fall, they fell apart.
The true revelation of American firepower came during the double raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg on August 17, 1943, the deepest penetration into Germany at that time. This mission was intended to demonstrate both the limitations of the P-7, its range, even with outboard tanks, and its terrifying effectiveness when used correctly. Major David Schilling, who led the 62nd Fighter Squadron, encountered a formation of Messerschmitt 110ths, destroyer aircraft, taking up a position to attack the B-17 with their heavy cannon and missile armament. Twin-engine German fighters, heavily armed but less maneuverable, were specialized killers of Luftwaffe bombers. A flight of 4 Schilling Thunderbolts turned over and plunged into an attacking dive from 28,000 feet. Non-commissioned officer Heinrich Roth, a gunner in one of the Messerschmitt 110ths, who survived, later recalled during interrogation, "American fighters descended like hammers from heaven. I opened fire from 800 meters away. Good hits. I saw them hit the fighter wing. The P-47 didn't even twitch. Then he fired. The plane ahead of us just collapsed. Not shot down, but destroyed. The wings were separated from the fuselage, the tail was torn off, the cockpit was crushed into metal confetti. In 2 seconds, the Messerschmitt 110 turned into nothing." 8 Messerschmitt 110ths were destroyed in less than a minute. German pilots had never encountered such concentrated firepower. Each P-47 carried 425 rounds per barrel, 3,400 rounds in total, weighing almost 900 pounds. At the convergence distance, usually set at 300 yards, the ballistic trajectories of all 8 guns intersected in a zone about 6 feet in diameter. Everything in this area was colliding with 100-inch shells per second, each of which was flying at a speed of 2,900 feet per second. The munitions themselves were a revelation of American industrial might. While German fighters had limited cannon ammunition, usually from 120 to 200 rounds for 20mm weapons, American pilots could fire for more than half a minute. The standard combat load mixed armor-piercing incendiary tracer, and standard ball ammunition in schemes designed for both destruction and ignition.
Francis Gaby Gabreski, who would become the top American ace in Europe with 28 wins, described the effect. "When you hit them out of all 8, they don't just fall, they explode. I saw how the Messerschmitt 109th was literally cut in half, the tail falling in one direction, the nose and wings in the other. The pilot didn't even realize what hit him." By September 1943, the Luftwaffe was discovering another terrifying reality about the P-47. Its performance improved dramatically with altitude, while the German fighters suffered. The turbocharged double Wasp engine maintained its rated power to 30,000 feet. German fighters relying on single-stage or two-stage mechanical superchargers saw their performance deteriorate significantly above 25,000 feet. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most successful aces with 206 victories, faced this reality fatally on October 8, 1943. Leading the Luftwaffe 1 against a formation of B-17s at an altitude of 28,000 feet above Bremen, Philipp discovered that his Focke Wolf 109A6 was sluggish and unresponsive in the thin air. The BMW 801's engine, powerful at medium altitudes, was suffocating from lack of oxygen almost 6 miles above the ground. When the P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group dived into their formation from 32,000 feet, the German fighters were sitting ducks. Robert Johnson, now an experienced combat pilot on his way to ace status, was flying at an altitude of 31,000 feet when he noticed Philipp's distinctive Focke Wolf with its intricate nose pattern. Johnson's combat report was clinical. "Opened fire at 300 yards, 30 degrees preemption. I observed hits all over the fuselage. The enemy plane exploded. The parachute was not observed." Philipp's death caused shock in the Luftwaffe. If one of their best, a man who had survived more than 500 combat missions on the eastern and western fronts, could not survive against the Thunderbolts, then what chance did average pilots have? The German High Command ordered an immediate investigation into the capabilities of the P-47. The report delivered to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring in November 1943 was sobering. The Thunderbolt's practical ceiling exceeded 42,000 feet, higher than any German fighter could reach. His dive speed was approaching the sound barrier. His armor included a 3/8-inch steel plate behind the pilot, half-inch bulletproof windshield, and armored deflector plates around the engine. Most worryingly, its sturdy construction allowed it to withstand damage that would have destroyed 3 conventional fighter jets and still return home. In January 1944, a new version of the P-47 began arriving in England, which would complete the transformation from a laughingstock into a nightmare. The P-47 D-22 was powered by a Hamilton Standard hydromatic propeller with 13-foot diameter paddle blades with wide cords that bit into the air like massive oars. The improvement in climb rate was immediate and impressive. While earlier Thunderbolts gained altitude at an anemic 2,200 feet per minute at sea level, paddle blade variants could reach 3,000 feet per minute, matching or surpassing German fighters at most altitudes. The massive propeller also improved acceleration, allowing the P-47 to gain power faster in level flight. Hauptmann Heinz Knocker of Luftwaffe 11, a veteran with more than 200 combat missions, encountered new options in February 1944 during the interception of bombers near Hanover. He wrote in his combat diary, "Fat American fighters have learned to gain altitude. We attacked the formation near Hanover, expecting our usual advantage. They turned towards us and were climbing with us. When we tried to get out of the fight, they followed us to 30,000 feet. Schmidt was overtaken and blown up. There was nothing left but smoke and fragments. These are not the same cars that we laughed at last year." The paddle blade propeller has done more than just improve performance. It changed the sound of the Thunderbolt. The distinctive thunderous roar created by the tips of the blades reaching supersonic speeds could be heard for miles. German ground troops reported that they could identify the approaching P-47 by sound alone, a deep, menacing rumble that meant death from heaven. They started calling it Donnerschlag, or thunderclap. By March 1944, the P-47, equipped with external fuel tanks, could escort bombers deep into Germany. The standard configuration carried 2 208-gallon wing tanks or a 75-gallon belly tank, increasing the range to over 1,000 miles. With a propeller with paddle blades providing improved performance even at full load, the Thunderbolts could fight on equal terms immediately after the tanks were dropped. The Luftwaffe's response was to focus on the bombers, hoping to inflict enough casualties to stop the American Day campaign. But this required flying through the escort barrier of the P-47, which became an increasingly suicidal occupation. German pilots developed a grudging respect, bordering on fear, for the large American fighter jets. Major Helmut Wieck, one of Germany's best aces with 275 victories, mostly on the Eastern Front, survived a clash with the P-47 on March 6, 1944, as a result of which he was seriously wounded. He later recalled in a post-war interview, "We saw them above us, thick silhouettes against the background of the sun. Someone laughed and said, 'Here come the flying pigs.' No one was laughing 30 seconds later. They came down like an avalanche, faster than we could react. The first pass destroyed 3 of our fighters. They just disappeared, turned into burning wreckage. Their guns didn't fire in bursts like ours. They poured out continuous streams of fire. Falling into this stream meant instant death." The escort missions revealed another advantage of the P-47: endurance. While German fighters were operating at maximum power settings that consumed fuel quickly, large American radial engines could cruise efficiently at high altitude. The Thunderbolts could stay with the bombers for hours, changing their top cover while saving enough fuel for combat and return.
As the P-51 Mustangs began arriving to take over long-range escort duties in the spring of 1944, the P-47 units increasingly focused on attacking ground targets in a role that would make them the most feared aircraft in the German arsenal. The transition began in earnest in April 1944, when the Allies were preparing to invade France. The Thunderbolt's heavy machine gun battery proved equally effective against ground targets. Standard armor-piercing incendiary ammunition could penetrate the upper armor of most German vehicles, while a huge volume of fire could destroy lightly armored targets in a matter of seconds. A 2-second burst fired 160 half-inch shells into a kill zone the size of a truck. But it was the addition of bombs and missiles that turned the P-47 into a real multi-purpose monster. The D-25 variant could carry 2,000-pound bombs under the wings and a 500-pound bomb under the fuselage, a bomb load equal to early medium wartime bombers. Later versions added zero-length rocket guides for 10 5-inch high-speed aviation missiles, each of which is equivalent to a 100-millimeter artillery shell.
Oberst Hans von Luck, commander of the 125th Panzergrenadier Regiment during the Normandy campaign, experienced the attacks of the P-47 on ground targets firsthand. They went low, so low that you could see the faces of the pilots. The sound was terrifying. The roar of engines, the screech of rockets, then the hammer of these heavy machine guns. The convoy of our trucks simply ceased to exist. 20 vehicles turned into burning wreckage in one pass. The psychological effect on people was devastating. They called them Yabo, fighter bombers, but it was more than that. It was flying artillery with sniper precision. On June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe discovered how completely the balance of power had changed. More than 500 P-47s provided air cover for the invasion, creating an impenetrable umbrella over the beaches. German fighters attempting to reach the landing zones were destroyed. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer of Jagdwaffe II, one of only 3 German pilots who reached the beaches that day, reported that the sky belonged to the Americans. The Thunderbolts were stacked from sea level to 30,000 feet. We tried to break through at dawn. 12 fighters from our group. I was the only one who came back. The P-47 was waiting at every height. You couldn't rise above them, couldn't dive under them. Their guns turned our fighters into aluminum rain. In the weeks following D-Day, the P-47 systematically destroyed the German movement during daylight hours. The statistics were staggering. In June alone, the Thunderbolts of the 9th Air Force claimed the destruction of 651 locomotives, 3,847 trucks, 512 tanks and armored vehicles, and 4,553 horse-drawn vehicles. The Wehrmacht was forced to move only at night, which seriously hampered their ability to respond to the Allied offensive. The Germans tried to resist the Thunderbolt threat with everything. They reinforced the armor of the vehicles, deployed more anti-aircraft guns, and developed new methods of camouflage. Nothing was working. The combination of speed, armor, and firepower of the P-47 made them almost unstoppable. Even the dreaded 88mm anti-aircraft guns had difficulty tracking fast-moving fighters at low altitude. While the P-47 was destroying Europe, it was also proving its worth in the Pacific theater of operations. The 348th Fighter Group, operating from New Guinea, found that the Thunderbolt's qualities were ideally suited to the vast distances and harsh conditions of the Pacific War. Colonel Neil Kirby, commander of the 348th, developed tactics specifically for the Pacific Ocean. On October 11, 1943, Kirby led 4 P-47s against 40 Japanese aircraft over Wyvek, shooting down 6 enemy aircraft himself in one mission, for which he was awarded the Medal of Honor. The Japanese, accustomed to fighting the nimble but fragile American fighters, were unprepared for the combination of firepower and durability of the P-47. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who encountered the P-47 over New Guinea, later wrote, "We called them monsters. Our 20mm cannon, which could destroy the pan with a few hits, seemed to have no effect. I fired dozens of shells at one Thunderbolt and saw it fly away. Their return fire was terrifying. Streams of heavy bullets that tore the planes apart." The P-47N, designed specifically for the Pacific Ocean, featured an increased capacity of fuel tanks with wet wings holding 93 gallons each, increasing the range to 2,350 miles. This variant will accompany the Bay-29s to Japan, proving that the 1943 short-legged fighter has evolved into a real long-range weapon.
Perhaps the final confirmation of the evolution of the P-7 came in its encounters with German jet fighters. The Messerschmitt Me-262, with its top speed of 540 miles per hour, should have been out of reach of fighter jets with propellers. But the Thunderbolt pilots found that they could catch up with jets in two situations: during takeoff and landing, when the jets were most vulnerable, and during high-speed dives from altitude. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John S. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group became one of the first pilots to shoot down the Me-262 on the P-47. Diving from 28,000 feet, Meyer's Thunderbolt reached speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, fast enough to catch up with the jet plane in level flight. The jet pilot, confident in his speed advantage, never saw the diving P-7 until the Meyer guns opened fire at 400 yards. Meyer's combat report noted, "The enemy aircraft collapsed under fire. Large pieces, including both engines, separated from the fuselage. The pilot did not escape." The concentrated fire of 850 caliber machine guns proved to be more effective than we expected against the jets. By the beginning of 1945, specialized variants of the P-47M were deployed specifically to counter German jet aircraft and V-1 cruise bombs. Thanks to water methanol injection, which increased power to 2,800 horsepower and improved aerodynamics, these final Thunderbolts could reach 470 miles per hour in level flight at 30,000 feet, fast enough to intercept even jet aircraft under certain conditions. Major George Bostwick, commander of the 63rd Fighter Squadron equipped with P-47, shot down two Me-262 in March 1945. His tactical report emphasized firepower over speed. Jet planes are faster, but they can't turn and they can't take hits. One good burst from our battery and they fall apart like they're made of paper. They have to slow down to attack the bombers. That's when we take them. The final demonstration of American industrial power occurred during Operation Boden Plateau, a desperate attempt by the Luftwaffe to destroy Allied aircraft on January 1, 1945. About 900 German fighters, including their best remaining pilots, launched surprise attacks on Allied airfields throughout Belgium and the Netherlands. At the airfield YG-34 near Metz, where the 365th Fighter Group P-47s was based, the attack initially succeeded. German fighters destroyed 22 Thunderbolts on the ground, along with several other aircraft. The captured German pilot, who was taken to the command post, pointed at the burning planes and mockingly said, "What do you think about this?" Major George Brookings' response became legendary throughout the 9th Air Force. He pointed to the runway, where ground crews were already pushing the damaged planes aside and preparing parking lots for replacement. "By tomorrow, we will have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" The German pilot's sneer disappeared. Within 48 hours, brand new P-47 D-40s filled the runway, delivered from bases in England. The Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft and 213 pilots at Boden Plateau, including many irreplaceable instructors and squadron commanders. They have never been able to make up for these losses. The Americans lost 134 aircraft in total at all the attacked airfields, all replaced within a week.
The numbers told the story of an inevitable defeat. Republic Aviation produced 15,683 P-47s during the war, more than any other American fighter. At the peak of production, the Farmingdale plant on Long Island completed one Thunderbolt every hour around the clock.
The factory in Evansville, Indiana, built on empty agricultural land in 1942, was producing 500 aircraft per month by 1944.
Each P-47D required 65,000 individual parts, 8 miles of electrical wiring, 2,000 pounds of aluminum, and 300 pounds of rubber. The engine alone contains 2,400 individual components, machined to thousandths of an inch tolerances. Nevertheless, American workers, many of whom were women who had never seen an airplane before Pearl Harbor, assembled these complex machines with precision exceeding pre-war standards. The production and ammunition was equally staggering. Each flight of the P-47 required 3,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, while hundreds of Thunderbolts carried out daily missions. The consumption of ammunition exceeded 10 million rounds per month by the middle of 1944. The Lake City Arsenal in Missouri, one of several ammunition factories, produced 30 million rounds of ammunition each month. Each cartridge was manufactured with tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch, which ensured reliable feeding through synchronized cannon mechanisms. The fuel consumption was huge. Each Thunderbolt burned 100 gallons per hour in normal flight, up to 300 gallons in combat with water injection turned on. The 9th Air Force alone consumed more than 25 million gallons of aviation fuel per month by the end of 1944. All of this was shipped across the Atlantic in tankers that were themselves American mass-produced products. Even more impressive than the aircraft production was the pilot training. By 1944, the United States was turning out 30,000 pilots a year from advanced training, more than Germany had trained during the entire war. Each P-47 pilot received a minimum of 400 hours of flight training before entering combat, including 100 hours on advanced fighters. German pilots, on the other hand, went into battle with less than 100 hours of total flight time by the end of the war. The quality showed up in battle. American pilots arrived in Europe trained in formation flying, instrument navigation, shooting, and tactics. They trained against captured German aircraft, understanding the capabilities and limitations of their opponent. They knew their aviation systems thoroughly, having studied technical manuals that German pilots had never received. Lieutenant Eugene Roberts, who arrived in England in September 1944, personified the advantage of American training. I had 420 hours in my flight book, including 75 hours on the P-47. I shot at towed targets, trained preemptive shooting, and studied the film from real-life flamethrowers. In my first mission, I knew exactly what to do. The German pilot I encountered couldn't have had half my experience. It wasn't even a fair fight. In March 1945, Oberstleutnant Joseph Priller, the same pilot who 2 years ago had ridiculed the P-47 as pregnant cows, was interviewed by German propaganda officials seeking to boost morale. His statement, deemed too demoralizing to publish, revealed a complete change in German attitudes. The Thunderbolt is the best fighter-bomber ever built. His firepower is unprecedented. Weapons that never jam, never overheat, and never run out of ammunition in normal combat. He carries bombs like a medium bomber, fires missiles like artillery, and fights like a fighter when needed. But apart from the car, there is what it represents: unlimited American production. They're losing 10, they're building 20. We're losing 1, it's gone forever. Their pilots arrive more prepared than our instructors. They have fuel for training, ammunition for practice, spare parts for everything. We have nothing but courage, and courage without resources is just a delayed defeat. We laughed at them in 1943. We are not laughing now. When you hear those guns, you know that death has come. The sound follows us, mechanical, precise, unstoppable. Like everything American, it's about overwhelming material superiority. They didn't beat us with better tactics or braver pilots. They buried us under an avalanche of steel and lead.
By April 1945, the Luftwaffe existed mainly on paper. Fuel shortages had grounded most aircraft. Experienced pilots were killed or captured. Airfields were destroyed by craters. But even with planes and fuel, German pilots faced an impossible equation. The attack meant a clash with the formations of the P-47s, who owned every height from the ground to 40,000 feet.
Sergeant Major Klaus Brettschneider, one of the last German pilots trained in 1945, flew exactly one combat mission before the end of the war. His collision with the P-47 over Leipzig lasted 12 seconds. I saw them diving from above, 4 Thunderbolts in perfect formation. I tried to turn, but they were too fast. The pursuiter fired from 500 meters away. My plane shook as if it had been hit with sledgehammers. The engine exploded, the wings separated. I barely escaped. In the parachute, I watched as they destroyed my entire flight. 6 fighters disappeared in less than a minute. Burning aluminum and bodies were pouring from the sky. The psychological impact was complete. German pilots developed what doctors call yabo fever, physical symptoms of stress that appear when Thunderbolts are reported in the area. Veterans who faced Spitfires and Hurricanes without fear became physically ill before missions against the P-47s. The distinctive rumble of approaching Thunderbolts caused panic among the ground troops, who knew that survival meant an immediate search for shelter. The final statistics of the P-47's operations defy understanding. In Europe, 3,752 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat. 3,315 planes were destroyed on the ground. 86,000 railroad cars were destroyed. 9,000 locomotives were destroyed. 6,000 armored fighting vehicles have been destroyed. 60,000 horse-drawn vehicles were destroyed. In the Pacific Ocean, 697 Japanese aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 150 aircraft destroyed on the ground, 1,500 vehicles destroyed, 150 locomotives destroyed, countless barges, ships, and installations. The 9th Air Force alone, equipped mainly with P-47s, flew 213,873 sorties, dropped 120,000 tons of bombs, fired 135 million rounds, and launched 60,000 missiles. Thunderbolt units achieved a victory ratio of 4.6 to 1 in aerial combat, while maintaining the lowest loss rate of any Allied fighter-bomber. There is a human cost behind these numbers. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 28,000 pilots killed in action against the Western Allied forces. Many died from the concentrated fire of American heavy machine guns. Each loss represented years of training that Germany could never make up for. By the end of the war, the average German fighter pilot had less than 30 hours of combat experience. The average P-47 pilot had more than 200. At the Luftwaffe Interrogation Center in Oberursel, captured Allied pilots were interrogated by German intelligence. Records captured in 1945 revealed German estimates of Allied aircraft. The dossier on P-47, which was constantly updated throughout the war, showed a complete reversal of opinion. April 1943. A large maneuverable fighter. It is inferior to the German models in all parameters, except for the speed of the dive. Machine gun weapons are not enough against fighters armed with guns. Assessment: minimal threat. December 1943. Exceptional altitude characteristics. Extreme structural strength. Firepower is becoming more and more problematic. The pilots demonstrate improved tactics. Estimate: significant threat above 25,000 feet. June 1944. The dominant fighter bomber. Surpasses all German models above 20,000 feet. Firepower is devastating against all types of targets. The structural strength makes downing extremely difficult. Assessment: critical threat at all altitudes. March 1945. The best fighter bomber of the war. The combination of firepower, durability, and performance is second to none. The quality of the pilots is exceptional. Assessment: it is impossible to survive in a direct collision. In 1985,
At a meeting of former German and American fighter pilots in Phoenix, Arizona, the former adversaries met in peace. Lieutenant General Adolf Golland, the former head of fighter aviation of the Luftwaffe, was asked about the P-47. His response, recorded on video, captured a complete transformation. "We made a terrible mistake in 1943. We saw this big, heavy fighter and laughed. Americans don't understand aerial combat, we said. They built a bomber and called it a fighter. We were the ones who didn't understand. The Americans did not try to build a European fighter jet. They built an American one, designed around manufacturing, firepower, and survivability. They realized that in a war of attrition, the aircraft that could withstand the punishment and inflict devastating firepower would win. They were right." When I flew the captured P-7 for the first time after the war, I understood everything. The power was incredible. He was gaining height as if he were falling upwards. The cabin was comfortable, the review was excellent, precise control. It was a pilot's plane wrapped in armor. But what really impressed me was the realization that America had built more than 15,000 of these complex machines, waging a war on 2 oceans. Each required an engine more sophisticated than anything Germany had ever produced. However, they built them faster than we could build simple fighters. That's when I realized we never had a chance. These guns, we called them Roosevelt pianos because of the sound they made. Once you hear this sound, you will never forget it. Many of my friends have heard it for the last time. The P-47 didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it destroyed it. The design of the P-47 perfectly represented the American industrial philosophy, the brute force of engineering backed by unlimited resources. Each component was overly durable, overly powerful, and over-engineered. The wing spars could support 40,000 pounds, which was 3 times the aircraft's loading weight. The engine mount could withstand an overload of 12 units. The control cables had been doubled throughout the structure with automatic backup systems. The ammunition supply system alone was a marvel of engineering. 8 separate cartridge boxes, each holding 425 rounds, were fed through electric injection motors to prevent jamming during intense maneuvering. The guns were heated electrically to prevent freezing at altitude. Each cannon had its own loading mechanism and could be individually synchronized. The convergence was adjustable from 150 to 400 yards, which allowed the pilots to optimize it for their preferred combat range. Even after the war, some German veterans claimed that the P-47 had won in quantity rather than quality, that the German fighters were technically superior but overwhelmed by numbers. The battle records tell a different story. In clashes where the numbers were equal, the P-47 consistently prevailed. Heavy machine gun weapons, which were dismissed as inferior to guns, proved to be more effective in real combat. An analysis of the film-firing guns showed why. Tannin shells, although individually more destructive, required precise targeting and had limited ammunition, usually 120 to 200 shells in total. The P-47 weapon created a probability cloud of bullets, which guaranteed hits even with imperfect aiming. At typical combat ranges, a 2-second burst would fire at least 20 rounds at a target the size of a fighter jet, enough to ensure destruction.
The ammunition itself was excellent. American 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary cartridges used a delayed fuse that provided penetration before detonation. The incendiary compound burned at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite the aluminum structure. German 20mm shells, although heavier, often exploded on surface contact, causing spectacular but sometimes superficial damage. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt remains the heaviest single-engine piston fighter ever mass-produced. Its empty weight of 10,000 pounds exceeded the total mass of some twin-engine fighters. Its engine produced more power than the entire bomber formations of the previous war. Its weapon provided more firepower than the infantry squad. Nevertheless,
It was built by the thousands, piloted by teenagers barely out of high school, and maintained in combat by mechanics who mastered their craft in a matter of weeks. The transformation of German opinion from ridicule to horror took less than 2 years. During this time, the flying milk bottle became the most terrifying aircraft in the Luftwaffe's experience. Veterans who faced Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Soviet Yaks without flinching spoke of the P-47 in whispers decades after the war. At the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, a restored P-47D stands among other legendary fighter jets. His nameplate lists his stats and combat achievements, but the real story is told by a small display case containing spent .50 caliber casings and a strip of film from a film cannon showing how a Focke Wolf 190 falls apart under fire. Under the exhibit is a quote from an unnamed German pilot, taken from the interrogation protocol of 1945. "We laughed when we first saw them. Fat, ugly American fighters who couldn't turn, couldn't climb, couldn't fight. We stopped laughing when we realized that they didn't need to turn or climb. They just pointed those guns at you and you ceased to exist." Laughter died along with our comrades. The P-47 Thunderbolt entered the battle as an object of ridicule and ended the war as an instrument of destruction. Between them, 8 synchronized Browning machine guns rewrote the rules of aerial warfare and buried the Luftwaffe under an avalanche of lead. German pilots laughed at a clumsy American fighter in April of 1943. By May 1945, there were no German pilots left to laugh at. Thunder rumbled, and the sky belonged to America.